It's Christmas time, and no better time to start a devotion but to tell a story about Christmas. Those of you that come from Kerala, my brother does. Is there anybody else from Kerala who's been to Kottarakara school? Many of you have. Some of you have. When you leave Kottarakara Junction and you walk up the old mud road. Now, I'm talking about 60 years ago when I was there. The road winds between paddy fields and hills on either side. It's just a beautiful sight. Finally, when you come up to the hill where the high school is, you make a sharp turn and you go up the side of the hill. And as you come up to the top of the hill, you see the back of the old boys' dormitory. You round that corner and an archway faces you, and you're walking through the archway, and on one side you have the dormitory, just two big rooms, about 40 or 50 students could sleep. And on the other side, there's a courtyard, and on the other side you have the preceptor's house. The Sabbath before Christmas, you know how things are in the old days. The school was closed. Most of the children had gone home. There were only about 6 or 7 kids left in the school. Most of them tiny kids, 6 and 7, 8, 10 years old. We had a combined luncheon for that Sabbath. Just some lentils and some rice and vegetable. Evening came, we lit the Petromax. Everybody know what the Petromax is? You do? You're old-timers. We lit the Petromax. We had a little game. And then at 10 o'clock at night, the Petromax was put off and everybody went to sleep. My father was away that Sabbath. Mother felt so sorry for the kids, had to stay back in school. So she decided we were going to make some tiny gifts. So she took some pencils and cut them in half and took some erasers and some candy and wrapped them up in colored paper. There was a tree in the courtyard. Dying, you remember the courtyard, it was basically just gravel, there was no water, only about 6 or 7 feet tall. So, middle of the night, my mother and I, in the light of the moon, we went down and tied these little presents, put the kids' names on it, tied them on the branches. And behold the wonder of the kids when they saw this in the morning, Sunday morning. They saw their names, they opened up the packages, they had such a wonderful time. The tree was dying, so about 6 or 7 days after that, 2 little boys were lugging a bucket of water. They were pouring the water at the base of this tree, and I shouted out at them, "Hey, what are you doing?" He said, "We love this tree. We hope this tree gives us the same fruit next year." It's a true story. But it's hope that really keeps alive life. It was hope that God gave to our first parents, Genesis 3:15. As they were being driven out from the Garden of Eden into this barren Mesopotamian desert, they looked for the promised child in every man-child that was born from then for 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years up until Jesus came. Don't know how many years that was. You know, Bishop Usher's calculations have not been proved wrong. The earth is probably at least 14,000 years old as far as civilizations go back. That's why they kept genealogy. Did you know that? You and I can't trace back genealogy because when that child was born, the genealogy stopped. Forever. No one ever kept genealogy after that. By Genesis 49, they knew that the child was going to be born to the tribe of Judah. Micah and Isaiah came along and they said it was going to be born in Bethlehem of Ephrathah. There were 2 Bethlehems, one up in the north, one in Bethlehem of Judah. But they did not know when he will be born. They knew what tribe, they knew what city, but not what time. Here comes 535 BC, and the book of Daniel was written, and Daniel had now forever etched in the scroll that the child would be sacrificed 490 years after the decree to rebuild Jerusalem was made. You remember that? You've read Daniel 8 and 9. Now that's easy math, isn't it? If you know when someone is going to be sacrificed, you could calculate backwards about 70 years. So all that you had to do was to calculate and say 420 years after the decree was given to rebuild Jerusalem. Somewhere in that time, after 420 years or 400 years, this Messiah would be born. You know, there are 300 prophecies in the old scriptures relating to Jesus. So that was easy math. But the Jewish people missed his birth. Except for two, as you know. You remember Simeon and you remember Anna. Both of them knew, after they had studied the prophecies, that Jesus was going to be born in their lifetime. So they prayed and they said, Lord, allow us to be alive when the consolation of Israel is here. And God honored their prayer. But the nation of Israel, the nation of Jews, had missed his birth. Do you know why? When you read Josephus and Hillel and Shammai, the old ancient historians of the Jewish people, here is what they say. That over a period of 400 years or so before Jesus came, there was a process of secularization of the Jewish people. In secular history, it's known as Hellenization. That God's people, even though they were chosen by God to be a certain peculiar people, to take his message to all the world, had now become secularized, interested in living very much like the other people, their neighbors. Do you think the secularization is only for the Jewish people in that time? I tell you this. I watch my church and I see the secularization process going on in our own churches. Have you seen some of the worship forms in churches today? There is a process called emergent church. Elder is sitting here. He knows what I'm talking about. Some of you know. The pastor knows. The emergent church. There's a church down the street up here where they have dancing up in the front and waving some of these beautiful saris and all of this stuff. And I agree for my church. The process of secularization prevented them from looking at the scriptures and understanding and studying it, the prophecies that God had placed there for their eternal salvation. So much so. And here is where our theology has gone wrong. When we look at what happened to the Jewish people in 70 AD, we say that the nation of Jews were destroyed and their temple was destroyed and the city was destroyed because they had crucified Jesus. Isn't that the teaching that we do? That's the theology that I learned. Except that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said in Luke 19:44, said, your city will be destroyed. There will not be one stone left on another. You know why? Because you have missed the time of your visitation. Simeon and Anna had talked about consolation of Israel. Lord, thank you for allowing me to see the consolation of Israel. Who needs to be consoled? Only those that are grieving. Only those that are hurt. Only those that are suffering. They missed the coming of Jesus. And that is why the nation of Israel and their city was destroyed. And even though this nation and this people were destroyed, God was preparing people elsewhere to honor him. And that's the story that we read just a little while ago. And you know, those of us on this side of the cross, we're preparing to meet Jesus. You know, there are all kinds of time prophecies in the scriptures. There are at least 6 in Daniel, and there are 12 in Revelation. Every time prophecy is stamped with time. I know. Jesus said, no one knows the time or the hour, the day or the hour, right? So we should not be worried about when Jesus is coming. We should not set time. Of course we should not set time. But there is plenty of prophecies in the scriptures when we actually want to take a look at 2300 days again. There are prophecies in the scriptures that tell us exactly when Jesus is going to come. Well, it may not be the same day, the day or the hour. The reason why we will miss his coming is because we haven't studied the prophecies. Because we are secularized, we have become more like the people of the world. But God in his wisdom prepares people to honor him. And here's the most beautiful thing that I have found about God. That God in his unfathomable mind of never-ending love conjures up his great designs and works his marvelous wonders, all to bring glory to his name and salvation to all people, everywhere. Let me show you what he did. Now, I know this story is somewhat of a difficult story. There are people, I've spoken to some Christians, say, now, Vijay, you don't really believe that story about these 3 men coming, these magicians, Magi coming from the east with gold and frankincense and myrrh and giving it. I mean, it's one of those stories, just like so many other stories in the scriptures. Josephus, I was reading actually on Josephus's writings about the Jews of that day, and he said that during this process of Hellenization, they began to look at the scriptures and began to think of it as a good suggestion from God, not really God's word. They were questioning the inspiration of God's word. Well, it is a good suggestion. We understand some of these stories. Well, I'm not sure about some of these stories. Well, let me tell you, I think this story is true, and I'll tell you why. Let me try to explain it the way I see it. Nothing ever happens in a vacuum. You're going to ask me, well, how did this Magi, this magician, the word Magi comes from the word magicians, how do they know? Well, in some translations it says Magi, in some it says wise men, in some it says kings. And they were all 3, and they were. They were magicians, they were wise men, they were kings. Well, how did this ever happen? Well, let me transfer you back to the book of Daniel that we mentioned just a few minutes ago. And if you look in the book of Daniel, you remember the time when Daniel and his 3 companions were taken to Babylon as captives. They were put in the Babylonian university. They graduated from there with great honors. They were actually the best graduates at that university. They were inducted into the hall of the hall of the wise men. In fact, they were inducted into the society of the magicians, the astrologers, the wise men, and the Chaldeans. Those are the 4 categories that we see in the Bible. And now I want to make this clear, unlike today when we look about magicians and sorcerers, which is what one of the 4 categories, we think of these people as those that practice the dark arts, witchcraft. Not so in the old days. These were people, sorcerers and magicians were those people that had control over the dark, the evil spirits. So the king, the first story is where the king sees this vision and he can't remember it the next day, and he calls the magicians and says, well, I saw a dream, but I can't remember it. Can you tell me what it is? And of course, they can't tell him. So the king decrees that all of them should be killed. So the king's guard goes out there and gathers them up, and they find Daniel. He's a member of the group. And Daniel asks for time, and they were given 24 hours, and Daniel prays. And God shows him what the vision is, and he comes to the king, and he tells the king that you have seen a vision of the statue. And the king falls down and worships Daniel and declares this, that's in chapter 2, that he honors the king of Daniel. In other words, in this polytheistic society, Daniel's God now becomes one of the high gods. Story number 2. The king then builds a big statue. Daniel's 3 friends refuse to bow down and worship. They are thrown into the lake of fire. They don't get burnt. They come out. And the king now decrees and puts out a decree to all the world, to all the kingdom, to the entire kingdom, saying that anyone that says anything against the God of heaven, the God of Daniel, will be now cut in pieces. That's like a fatwa, isn't it? The Muslims have fatwa. Anyone, you say anything about Allah, you'll be cut in pieces. Babylon has 90 provinces. King's decree now goes to all of the provinces. You know, horsemen take these decrees, the scrolls, and they are read in the provinces. The governors of the provinces now have the duty to establish this God as one of the gods, the supreme God of the universe. Daniel is now being elevated to a higher position. He gets in charge. He gets to be the governor of the province of Babylonia. And then in chapter 3, you see that a third time, the king's mind is lost. He's out in the field. He's eating grass. Someone said, I don't know whether he was on grass before. That's what made him lose his mind, or either way, we're not sure. But at any rate, he was on grass and he lost his mind. God restores his mind. And when God restores his mind, he says to the entire kingdom of Babylon, all 90 provinces get the decree from the king. See, in every province, there is a center of learning. And when the king's decree comes, these men have to then go ahead and implement the decree and also start to learn. Finally, if you remember, Babylonian kingdom is beginning to end. Belshazzar's, at night, Belshazzar has a dream and sees the writing on the wall, and no one knows how to read it. They call Daniel in. Daniel interprets the writing on the wall. Belshazzar says to him, if you can interpret the writing on the wall, I will make you the third person in the kingdom. He was number 1. The second person was away in a campaign against the Greeks, so therefore he would be the third person. Of course, the Medo-Persians came in that night. Belshazzar was killed, beheaded, and Daniel was the one that handed over the key to the entire kingdom of Babylon to the Medo-Persians. In chapter 6, you will see, not only had Daniel risen up the ranks of the wise men in the entire kingdom, he was the one that the God of heaven speaks to. He was the one that speaks to the God of heaven 3 times a day. Did you know that? 3 times a day, he would get down on his knees and pray. He was the one that could reveal all secrets. He was the one that no fire could touch, no lion could eat. Darius the Great now makes him prime minister of the entire Medo-Persian Empire. Not only is Daniel the wisest man in this company of wise men, he is also the prime minister. That's like the Pope and the Charlemagne joined together in one person. He is the most powerful person in the entire Medo-Persian Empire. That's why when you go to the Middle East, and I've been to the Middle East, You will not see a monument to Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Cyrus the Great, Darius. But 2,500 years ago, they built a monument to Daniel. He is the only one that is still revered and respected by three great religions: Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. People come to worship at his mausoleum. Just about 7 miles from Shushan the palace, and I've been there, so I know, I've seen it. When the writings of Daniel became available, 535 BC, this became the catechism to be read in every province of Medo-Persian Empire, which was 120 provinces. I'm not making all this up. It's all in your Bible. It's in chapter 6. You can read it. Daniel's writings become so important because the God of heaven has revealed to Daniel what will happen to the nations of the world in the future. And the writing says, even before the Medo-Persian Empire was ever there, 535 BC, it said that all of these empires will end. Greek Empire, Roman Empire. But a king will be born, even though he will die at the end of that 490-year period. His kingdom will last forever. Well, that certainly is a kingdom that we want to know about. If such a king is to be born, every generation of wise men from that time onward studied the prophecies of Daniel and understood that when the decree came in 457 BC, you add up the years, at some point, this great king is going to be born. So they looked forward to it. That's how these magicians, wise men, and kings came to know that the greatest king in the world was going to be born. Now somebody's going to say to me, all right, you have explained that. Now tell us about the star. I know, I'm hard-pressed to discount God's power in the heavens. I don't know. I mean, some physicist friend of mine says, look, Vijay, stars just don't come up in the sky and start moving forward, that's all mythological stuff. Mythology is there. I agree. But have you read Matthew 24 in Revelation lately? Did you know that everything that happens on this earth has a celestial sign attached to it, including the coming of Jesus? There is always something celestial happening. That's exactly what 1844 was based on, wasn't it? Falling of the stars, darkening of the moon and the sun. Everything that happens there, celestial signs, is accompanied by something here. What? Those of you that are from India, you remember that just about 25 years ago, the Indian Parliament set aside the elections because the planets had not aligned themselves. You remember that? Not 25, 30 years ago, wasn't it? And no marriage takes place in India. No marriage takes place in India unless the stars are lined up. I know this sounds like mythology to you, but God sometimes even honors their thinking and their belief. God brought a star. A physicist friend of mine said, well, all right, I'll believe that a star was born, the light came up, and that's true. Sometimes, hundreds of years go by, thousands of years go by before we see the light of a star. Well, how do you explain them moving? I don't know. Physicist, Max Planck was the one that talked about the certainty principle. In other words, everything in this world on a physical basis, physics is based on the fact that everything is the same everywhere. Principle of certainty. That's why E equals mc squared wherever you go in the world, right? Except now we know there's something called Heisenberg principle of uncertainty. So, just the fact that you observe something makes it move in a different fashion, in a different way. That's Heisenberg's. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about how God made. Maybe God had one of his little cherubims to drag the star over, all through Middle East when these three men were traveling. However, God did it. The story says that the star moved in front of these men. That's an arduous journey. They saw the star. Tradition tells us that there were three wise men, magicians, but they were magicians, they were wise men, they were kings. They were kings, as you know, when the Medo-Persian Empire finally disappeared, these provincial capitals were taken over by these people that ruled, the governors, and they declared themselves as kings. So when these kings came, they are coming from the east. There is anecdotal evidence to show that Medo-Persian Empire actually went as far east as beyond Persia into Afghanistan and India. As you know, Pakistan was part of India in those days. And there is stories actually in parts of northern India and Bhutan and Sikkim about a king that was born to the Jewish people that would rule the entire world. I'm not making these up. These are stories that I have read. So the wise men, these kings, saw the star, and they understood that this was the star that was to declare the new king that is born. So they decided to travel, and they take gifts. Tradition tells us, even gives them name, Melchior, Balthasar, and Gaspar. One of them must have been from India. You know why? Because frankincense at that time was only found in India, from the bark of a tree. And as you remember, frankincense was the incense that in the temple that they used. Remember the incense that they burned in the temple where the priest? But there could have been more than three wise men. We don't know. There were three gifts. And certainly three wise men won't travel by themselves. They may have been their bodyguards, their soldiers. There may have been 500 people, maybe 1,000 people. Who knows? We don't know. But certainly they did go. They traveled. And we are also this side of the cross, we are also on a journey. And let me draw some parallels before I close. Three wise men, maybe one from India, one from Afghanistan, one from Persia. They spoke different languages, they ate different foods, they dressed differently. Very much like us. There's Tamil here, Telugu, Malayalam, and all kinds of different. You don't eat the same food that I eat. You don't dress the same way, some of you do, but, we all travel together. There's one purpose that holds us together. What is it? We are all looking for Jesus. Yes or no? Absolutely. That's what binds us together. That's why these three wise men and their big entourage were going, because they were going to see Jesus. There is nothing that holds people together like Jesus. This is an arduous journey. It took them a year and a half or more after they started. And I envision them traveling through the Middle East. I've been through the Middle East myself in a bus, so I know how it is. They must have started from the capital there in Persia and down to Isfahan and Shiraz and on up to Ecbatana. And they must have crossed the river. They had to cross Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Got to cross that in the summertime, and otherwise the water level is too high. So they must have crossed it up north and then came down to Damascus. And then from Damascus, they made their way down to Jerusalem. It's an arduous journey. Traveling together as God's people is an arduous journey. And it's not always easy, is it? As you have found out. You have to split away sometimes. One thing intrigued me in this journey. It took them a year and a half to get down there. If you go, let me just move out here for a minute. I don't want to disturb the being taken there, photograph being taken there. But when you go down from Damascus down toward Jerusalem, up about 7 or 8 miles north of that, before you come to Jerusalem, the road to Bethlehem veers off to the left. And the road to Jerusalem goes straight. Something puzzled me in this story here. Why did these men go to Jerusalem? Well, they went to Jerusalem because they thought that's where Jesus is going to be. Yes or no? Well, the king's palace is there. If he's born a king, he should be in the king's palace. Certainly, the star did not go to Jerusalem. We also sometimes think that Jesus is here. People go to some certain churches thinking that they will find Jesus. They will find God there. Jerusalem was a distraction. Sometimes we wonder whether some churches do have Jesus at all. A friend of mine was telling me a story about our old Tacoma Patches. This is about 60, 70 years ago. Might have been even last century, I'm not sure, Emancipation time. When the church first started. It was all white, black men went there and they told him they gave him $1 and told him to go down to the church downtown. Well, he died and he went to heaven and complained to St. Peter that he was not allowed into the church. And St. Peter said, well, Jesus, I've been trying to get in there too, and they wouldn't let him in either. There are churches and congregations that are in existence where Jesus is not present. Now, you're going to ask me how. I am telling you, just like Ichabod, that the glory of God had departed 400 years before Jesus came to this world and died, God's glory had departed the Jewish people. It is just as possible today that churches and congregations, I'm not talking about Adventist churches, I'm talking about other churches and denominations, that you could go on for centuries. One of the biggest congregations over there in California just closed down their services just about 2 months ago. It's called the Crystal Cathedral. You know about that. The Spirit of God did not lead these men to Jerusalem. For a moment, they thought to themselves, see, this is the way the mind works. After all, if the king is to be born, he must be born in Jerusalem. That's the capital. If he's going to be born, he must be born in the king's castle. So they went to the king and they asked the king, where is he that is born king of the Jews? And the king says, well, I don't know. Well, obviously he didn't know because he wasn't studying the prophecies. So the king says, calls the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Let me just digress just a little bit. Now that I mentioned about Pharisees and Sadducees. Some of you are well aware of the turmoil that's within the church since our new president has been inaugurated, Ted Wilson. We are going backwards. Some of you read the blogs, you've seen it, huh? We're going backwards. Let me tell you what happens among God's people. And before Jesus comes, this is what's going to happen to God's people. Just like the Jews, there is a secularized segment of the Jewish people that wanted to be Hellenistic, identified themselves with the culture. Certainly they went to the church, they went to the synagogue to worship. They did not even believe in the resurrection. You know who they were? What's their names? That's what they were sad. They were sad, you see, because they didn't believe in the resurrection. There were Pharisees, on the other hand, that wanted to make it even stricter. So they began to enforce more and more laws. They had 630 laws in addition to the 10 that God had given. Just so that you'll be able to keep the 10 laws, you added on 630 more. 30 laws just to keep the Sabbath. I worry about my church. Last General Conference session, they added one more. Now we have 28. If they would just leave God's 10 commandments alone, why not? I know I'm kind of radical about these issues, and I'm the same way wherever I am. I'm on the board of trustees of your university, and when I speak, I do the same thing over there. I have trouble with these issues. Just leave the Bible alone. I'm not saying that the 28 principles are bad in any way. All that I'm saying is that when you start to say that you cannot come and worship with me because you drink tea in the morning, it really bothers me. I love Sukhandagle's tea. That's another matter, but I only get to drink it maybe every 2 or 3 times a year. Fantastic tea. You ought to go to her house sometime. The problem with the church is this. The more secularized our people become, the more stricter certain segment of our church becomes. Wait and see. That's going to keep on happening till Jesus comes. So they went to Jerusalem in search of Jesus. People go to all kinds of churches searching for Jesus and they don't find him. If they would only look at the star, finally they came out of the city. They looked at the star and they found the star. The star was over there in Bethlehem. Here is our guiding star. Right here. Don't go to church seeking Jesus. Look here. This is the guiding star. You don't have to be reading all kinds of fancy stuff to find Jesus. You find him right here. I know. I'm touching, sensitive nerves here. I don't read Harris, J.K. Harris and all those other people. I don't need it. If I want to find Jesus, right here is Jesus. I need to close, but let me finish the story. So they're coming out of the house. They saw the star east. They went on ahead until it stopped over where the child was. They went in and they worshipped him. How did they worship him? They bowed down and worshiped him. All of this fancy, new emergent church worship, I'm not sure about that. Here the Bible says every time you bow down, that's real worship. Every religion teaches us that to bow down before God is man's duty. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts. When you come to church, you have to bring a gift. You come to worship, bring a gift. Only 60% of Seventh-day Adventists give tithe. And less than 30% give 3% of their income as offerings. As far as I know, you can't go to church and worship without giving tithe and without giving offerings. And I'm going to close, because I know I was given only 20 minutes. I'm going to close. And the story ends by saying, when they had worship, presented him with gifts, they went another way. If you have met Jesus, you can't walk the same way anymore. You can't eat the same food anymore. You can't dress the same way anymore. You have to walk another way. This new year, as you plan for this new year, my prayer for all of us is that we are going to walk a new way with Jesus. That's my prayer for you, and I hope that's your prayer for me as well. God bless us.